and welcome to today's OpenTeams community event. I'm Brian Skin, the open source architect community manager here at OpenTeams, and I'll be your host for today. OpenTeams is the single point of contact and procurement for your open source training, solutions, and support needs. Visit openteams.com, or reach out to us at connect@openteams.com to learn more. As part of OpenTeams' overall mission to sustain and support open source, we are also sponsoring the Open Source Architect community with the goal of providing a dedicated space for experts to connect and collaborate over their favorite open source technologies. To learn more or to apply for membership, visit openteams.com/OSA-community. For today's event, we'll be staying in-house. I'll be spending the hour here in conversation with OpenTeams founder and CEO, Travis Oliphant. Many of you out there either know Travis or know of him and his work, and you know that he's been on a tireless mission in support of open source sustainability. As we noted in the event description, first, software ate the world, and now open source is well along in the process of, in turn, eating software. But for all the innovative power that the open source model brings, it also brings some significant challenges, not least in terms of sustainability and financial sustainability in particular. Well, Travis is here today to talk about that topic of open source sustainability and his journey exploring it, past, present, future. So thanks again to everyone here for attending. Please post any questions you might have during the conversation into the Zoom chat or the Q&A. We'll address them as we can. We are recording today's event, and that video will be posted on the OpenTeams YouTube channel once we have it ready. So subscribe there to be notified when it goes live. All right, let's get started. Travis, hello. Welcome. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much. I appreciate you organizing these events and kind of helping jumpstart the open source architect community, which is a new community, but it's just the next evolution of something that's been starting for a long time. And just an opportunity to get people talking together about obviously a problem that's really important to me and it's for a long time. Then how do we get more community-driven open source and get it supported by the companies that depend on it and the organizations that depend on it? And there's a related challenge, which is how do we create more community around open source, which is related to the talent problem of how do people go from, I don't know anything about open source to now I'm a maintainer and a creator of a popular open source project. How does that work? And can anybody participate? And what's the story there? So there's a lot of potential topics to cover here, but I think I appreciate the chance. So thank you for organizing this and all the work you do for the OSA community.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's a privilege to be able to help out in the ways that I can. So there's a lot of material out there about your background. Like, for example, I'll link to the Lex Freeman interview you did last fall for a lot more detail there. But just to set the context here, why don't you give a quick overview of your history with open source from the late 90s to today?
Great. Okay. I will. Let me turn off Do Not Disturb so I don't get my computer bothering me in the middle of the conversation. So my background in open source really starts from science. I'm a scientist by trade and by study, an applied mathematician, and then medical imaging and getting information out of data. That's my first discovered serious use of computers. I've been a computer hobbyist since I was 11. Doing basic programming and like many folks have been dabbling with computers and doing little things here and there all the time. Serious use of computers during my education, learned C, encountered Python early on, 97, roughly started using Python. Python 1.4 was my very first version. Python 1.5.2 came out later. In the process, I saw a real opportunity to have scientists use Python more. What I loved about Python in particular was its simple syntax. It allowed me to think about my science and not programming arcanity. Issues with the lack of semicolons was a feature to me. The fact that the lack of curly braces meant I didn't have all this extra stuff. I just saw the code and it kind of matched my English language sense. So I loved it, and I came about it, used it for a year, realized I was still using it after a year, still understood what I written a year earlier. And I thought, this is something really cool. I'm going to do more of this. And so then kind of got involved in the community on mailing lists, met a lot of wonderful people, realized there's a lot of opportunity. And as a grad student, I had a little more time. There was no one directing exactly what I should do to finish my PhD. So I basically took some of that time and wrote a bunch of extension modules for Python. Those extension modules were later collected. I helped collect them with others into a library called SciPy, which we released in 2001. And then NumPy emerged in 2005, I basically took some about 3 months where I didn't have a class as a university professor, saw the growing divergence between numeric, which is the array library that existed when I started in Python. It was written in 95 by Jim Huguenin as a grad student at MIT, and then he later went to Microsoft and then to Google, where he's currently, I believe, still underneath the Dart language and Flutter. So Jim Huguenin did this great work in creating numeric, loved a lot of the ideas there. The Hubble Space Telescope people were creating NumArray about 2001. I got a call from Barry Greenfield there because of the work I was doing in SciPy. We knew each other, and he was kind of asking, saying, hey, we really need to build a better array library. And so Jim Huguenin had moved on at that point and was at Microsoft, still interested, but not active in the community. And then Perry basically said, well, we got to make improvements. So they started writing something called NumArray. Brought a lot of great ideas, NumArray. But what I saw as a SciPy author is people started writing modules that only worked on NumArray. And we had modules that worked on numeric. And so you saw this sort of bifurcation in the industry. And the industry was very young. It wasn't like an industry is almost too big of a concept to say. It was a small community of active users who were interested in each other, really an academic community, really. And so, we would gather at SciPy conferences, which started in 2001. There was 50 to 75 of us that would gather. You could fit them in a bus, for example. I saw that as a problem. I saw the opportunity, but I saw this problem. And so, not really knowing where to lead or not having any funding to do it, not having any support from anybody except my own desire and passion, I spent 3 months writing a unification of numeric and NumArray called NumPy. And that 3 months, I thought, okay, this will take me 3 to 6 months. It did to write the first version. It took another year to basically do the social work and the connection with people. In fact, I started up front with it. I mean, a big part of it, what I've realized for a long time, is open source communities are much more than code. They're actually communities. There's 3 words in open source community: open source community. Open is you can access it. It's very transparent. It's not things are clear. At least they try to be. They try to be clear about what's available. Source is the code's available, and you can see it, read it, learn from it, understand it. But the community is about the people and the opportunity to connect and coordinate. And even then, that was in 2005, 18 years ago. 2006, NumPy finally was released. So that really got me. I was been steeped in this since '97, and it's been a wonderful privilege to sort of watch some of the things I've done have real success and be used all over the world with the help of many, many people. So I was a professor doing that about 16 years ago. I really wanted to see, how do we scale this? How do we do more and more of this? And so left being a professor to come to Austin, come to friends and really focus on entrepreneurship. How do we build companies and help and patterns and incentive structures that actually enable lots of people to thrive around open source? So you could say that what I've been trying to do ever since is create systems, incentive alignments, opportunities that I wish I would have had. I wish would have been there when I was looking around what I want to do next from grad school.
Speaks
there's a lot of stuff happening now, and get into that, but that's kind of how I got started and where. Now, since then, coming here, I worked at a consultancy for many years called NumFOCUS, and we did consulting with large companies and got to understand how big companies are using the software. People started adopting NumPy about 2008 in space, like pretty seriously. Got embedded in lots of code inside of large banks, inside of large oil gas companies, inside of manufacturing companies. People were using NumPy, and then watched as pandas emerged in 2011 and accelerated the adoption even farther, as people didn't have to then understand matrix math. They could just see a data frame, and they could understand simpler processes and convenience functions that were really, really effective. And so pandas emerged. Then I sit and watched as Jupyter notebooks emerged to make it more accessible, and very much involved with my friends who were part of this group. With Peter Wang, I started Anaconda in 2011. 2011, we had started also NumFOCUS, and that was, so I was at the same time kind of starting Anaconda and starting NumFOCUS with different groups of people. Anaconda, a commercial enterprise with a co-founder and funders, and NumFOCUS was my community friends creating a board and going after nonprofit status. But we did have a little I was able to unify them a bit by funding the first executive director at NumFOCUS. She was paid out of Anaconda's budget,
Hmm.
right? How does this even work? And that happened until we found a funding mechanism for NumFOCUS.
Right.
So this has been going on for a long, long time. We talk in detail about every specific journey, but I think that's generally, you can see that's been of interest for a long time. I left Anaconda full time. Longer story there, but suffice it to say now, Peter Wang, a co-founder, is running Anaconda, which I'm super thrilled about. He's doing a
Yeah.
great job, and excited for the growth of Anaconda and what it means. It's able, ultimately the reason I founded Anaconda was to create a funding vehicle to sponsor open source.
Mhm.
I wanted to generate revenue, and there's a general principle here that I've sort of learned over the years, which is charity is awesome. I love the idea of nonprofits. They're awesome. You get about 100 to 1,000x less productivity if you just rely on charity.
Yeah.
It's about that order of, if you just rely on people's kind of goodwill and hope and people want to be good, they do, but we're all constrained and we have lots of stuff to do.
Yep.
So it's about that order, somewhere between 100 and 1,000x. If you can create aligned incentives, if you can create aligned opportunities where somebody needs something and an open source helps provide it, and you connect the dots with a financial instrument that where it's a win situation, you get 100, 1,000x more money. And so that's kind of been, I love nonprofits. We started NumFOCUS as a mechanism to do that, but I also recognize the important need of creating industry patterns. So, and we can talk about, we're sort of experimenting there for a while. Anaconda was the first, and it's done really, really well. Excited about it. Learned a lot of lessons in how we created Anaconda. And so we recreated the foundations of Anaconda in 2018 in a company called Quansight. So many people may not be aware, but Anaconda first was called Continuum Analytics. And it was a consultancy that was exploring product development. And effectively, Quansight is the recreation of Continuum Analytics organization such that it could produce multiple Anacondas in the future, as opposed to just Anaconda growing out of one. So it's basically learn the patterns of what we did at Continuum Analytics, and then figure out how to replicate it and help empower many, many other people to do the same thing. So that was the origins of Quansight. And right as soon as Quansight, kind of the next year, I kind of stumbled on an idea, right? And we won't have time to talk about this idea in this webinar or this conversation, because there's many more things to talk about, but it's an idea that's still emerging, still incubating. And it's an idea that could make open source essentially a marketplace for open source and completely and be a really substantial pillar in the sustainability challenge, because you make a market alignment and a market incentive and have open source at the foundation of that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but to get that happening, I thought to make that happen, I would need to create a venture fund. And so in 2019, we created a venture fund called Quansight Initiate. And so, I remember the moment, because I basically had this epiphany, like, and I think to make this happen, I need a venture fund. So how am I going to do a venture fund? Because venture funds are actually a big deal. And we were able to raise a small one and get started in the venture fund. We're now on fund 2 of Quansight Initiate. And we have a target for fund 3, probably into 2025, maybe end of 2024. Because we understand a lot more about how we actually do a venture fund, how that works, and how to grow it. But it's a long tail opportunity. So that's one thing, is create a venture fund. One thing we've done that I want every venture fund to do, if we're successful, we can get them to do it, is have part of the carried interest, part of the earnings that the fund makes. Funds, I don't know people how they work. You basically have a series of partners, limited partners, who give you their money. And you have a general partner that manages that money and manages the investments. A general partner also contributes money, but is in charge of managing where the money goes and who it goes to, and picking the investments. So the general partner, for that extra work, negotiates something called carried interest. So they benefit from their participation of their money, but they also benefit from growth of the investment. So this is a very common structure. It's actually undergirds lots of hedge funds, lots of partnerships. But venture funds are well-known partnerships that do this. But carried interest, roughly it's around, it varies, but it's 15 to 30%. of the game. There's usually a hurdle. There's usually you have to get to a certain amount of return. And then at that point you share. And you
Hmm.
get somewhere 50 and 30% of the gains go to the general partner, and then the rest is split to limited partners.
Right, right.
That's kind of how it works. It's very generic. It's very simple. It's very generic across every multiple organizations do that same thing.
Hmm.
But what we did at Quansight Initiate, which is a little unique, is we basically guaranteed a part of that carried interest to an open source research lab called Quansight
Hmm.
Labs. So
Yeah.
we created Quansight as a consultancy. We also created an open source research lab called Quansight Labs,
Hmm.
and it's funded partly by this venture fund.
Proceeds from it, right.
Proceeds from the venture fund. So long term, it's a long term strategy. One
Hmm.
thing that's about investments is, especially early stage investments or investments in startups, is they sit there for a long time. It might
Hmm.
be 10 years before you actually get any money, right? Before the value of the thing you've created actually materializes in a market.
Hmm.
Many of us are familiar with the markets where we go and buy and sell. We buy equity in a market that's traded publicly. Go buy
Hmm.
NVIDIA stock, go buy Meta stock, go buy Google, Microsoft, whatever. It's available. So they call it liquid because you can go to a broker and buy it tomorrow.
Yep.
There's 100x more companies out there that actually have owners that are essentially equivalent. They're C corps, in many cases Delaware C corps, just like the publicly traded companies.
Yeah.
They're actually legally identical. The only thing that's not identical is they don't have a market where their shares are being traded.
Hmm.
So they're not public, they're private, but
Yep.
they're still owned. And what's happened over the past 20 years is some of these 30 years is a lot of companies are staying private longer, which means that the value accrued to the company growth is accruing to private investors and not available
Hmm.
to the public markets. It's a
Hmm.
known issue. And I bring it up partly to try to help explain this gap that's absolutely there between the money that's out there. People, the exact amount of money that's available for investment is hard to pin down, but it's tens of trillions of dollars. I've heard 90 trillion. I've heard
Wow.
100 trillion. I've heard, if you think about the money that's out there looking for alpha, looking for investment.
Yeah.
And this is not just billionaires with their buckets, but it's some of that for sure. It's also, the massive number of people who have 401ks or who have retirement plans or have a pension with the company they work with. Somebody has to take that money and do something with it.
Hmm.
Like many of us, put it in the bank. Okay, cool. What is the bank going to do with it?
Load it
Like,
out.
they can sit on the money. I mean, they
Yeah.
could,
Yeah.
but return of value, they go and invest it.
Hmm.
And everybody these days, most people are probably putting 10%, let's say 1 to 10% of their bucket of money. That might be that $90 trillion. Let's say 10% of it is available for company investing.
Hmm.
So $9 trillion is available for company investing. And that's being routed through various partnerships and venture funds and eventually to companies. But you see all this money looking for alpha. And at the same time, you see in the technical industry world, where's the innovation coming from?
Hmm.
Where's innovation been? Well, over the past 10 years, pretty much all the innovation you see out there has been open source code, open source creation. Now, there's a difference. You have some of that innovation is coming from company sponsored or company backed open source.
Hmm. Yeah.
But there's a lot of it that is essentially community driven, and you
Organic.
have
Yeah.
this organic story as well. So I'm going to get into the details of kind of what motivates open source participants and how this maybe works and what the phenomena is. But it very much is like observing nature a bit, because at the end of the day, open source is people,
Hmm.
and it's open source is millions of people, and
Yeah.
so it is like observing nature and a bunch of decisions that are being made. So what I feel like we're trying to do is create opportunities, incentive alignments, and mechanisms so that open source, community-driven open source can thrive, and
Hmm.
people who participate in open source can have strong careers, like
Hmm.
long-lasting careers, and feel like they've been able to make a difference to the world as a whole.
Yep. So I guess to summarize a bit, you had your introduction to open source early on. You saw your personal excitement about it, and then you started to see the value to not just yourself, and the community, but to academia, to business. Saw the sustainability issues yourself firsthand as you were working on NumPy. Like, oh, this would be great to move faster, but I can't. I don't have the support I need to do that. And then that kicked off this mission to basically experiment and explore does this business model work? How does business work? How does, how can one entity pay another or fund another? Exploring, iterating, and continue to try to develop, over time, systems and companies that work better and better, to match up all those different aspects.
Exactly. Perfect. Exactly. And I would say, so Anaconda was one of those. Quansight is one of those. At Quansight, we created a fund, and then OpenTeams is the latest iteration of that. And OpenTeams has a couple of features, of factors, and what it's doing. But that's really why OpenTeams exists as well. OpenTeams exists to continue this journey of how do we help open source communities thrive and companies make better use of open source. So specifically, OpenTeams' mission is to help companies use open source to create better business solutions. It's very much comes out of the observation that we've had at both Anaconda, Consumer Analytics, Anaconda, before that NThought, where I worked as a consultant, and then now at Quansight. A lot of companies use open source. Most of them use it ineffectively.
Because it's brand new. It's the paradigm is different, and they don't really know how to interface with it, at least in part.
That's right. That's right. In part, like a lot of the developers do.
Right.
Engineers,
sure.
They're understand it pretty well. Oh, it's there. I can grab it. I can use it. I understand on it. And then it goes to, okay, now, oh, wait a minute. I just essentially made a dependency on this open source software that I don't really even know how it's being produced, or is it being produced? So there's this information gap, basically, and this dependency. A lot of people don't realize they've essentially absorbed a technical debt on this community, and they're not thinking about how they're going to actually help manage that technical debt. It's sort of a adapt and pray approach, right? They're going to absorb all this code, and it's cool. You can make progress really, really fast, quickly. It's amazing. But then you think about, well, long term, what does that mean for my deployment, my management, the things I have to care about? And there are things you have to care about as a company around liability, exposure, production. How am I going to maintain this tomorrow? What happens if I lose the people that are working with me now, who they're great now, but they go take other jobs? And now what? That person that pulled in that dependency on this really cool tool, but I have nobody else to maintain it. Like, all these issues are real issues that companies come up with, have. So we see the opportunity at OpenTeams to basically become essentially open source shops. Back in the day, and I kind of matured in the 90s when there was the idea of IBM before this. You never got fired for choosing IBM because IBM was with you to support you as a company, right? And IBM still has a lot of legacy contracts. A lot of people look at IBM and go, "Who is IBM today? What are they doing?" Not really understanding that below the surface, there's still thousands and thousands of companies that rely on IBM every day, and IBM supports them because they were IBM shops, and IBM stood with them and isn't going anywhere, right? And that's why they did it, because now they had a partner to trust. Microsoft did the same thing. They understood that, built the same model. So Microsoft emerges as a organization that you become a Microsoft shop. Now they've pivoted a bit, they've had to, but essentially the same. There are people that still are leveraging Microsoft's tools, and they become Microsoft shop because Microsoft supports them.
And not just Windows, not just Office, but an entire suite of tools.
The whole entire suite, Access and databases, and now moving on to Azure. That's why Microsoft has been the most competitive with AWS's cloud, because they've had that existing enterprise infrastructure and relationships to connect. And actually, they're moving. We can talk the AI revolution, because Microsoft's done a pretty good job. Am I back? I think there's a little bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, but you're good now.
They did a good job in connecting to the open AIs of the world, but we can save that conversation for a little bit, about how does AI, might AI transform the market here. But let's talk about. But that led to the realization there needs to be there's an opportunity for an organization that it helps companies become open source shops, and you see it currently in the market where a lot of companies, especially early for a little while when there was, prior to people kind of shrinking back a little bit of shrinking of the economy over the past couple of years, in some areas, a lot of people pushed OSPOs, open source program offices, right? And in many ways, OpenTeams enables companies to have small open source program offices, smaller offices. We basically can help your organization be an open source shop. and provides you the stability and long-term maintainability of your open source software. So how we do that is essentially it's like a big consultancy and product company, but we don't hire all the consultants. We're like maybe similar to Costco or similar to Walmart or similar to Amazon, where we have a network of suppliers. And we recognize that the open source community is a very rich ecosystem of lots of different people. And so at OpenTeams, we focus on the leaders, the people who will manage a project for you. We call those folks solution architects. And we have a community of solution architects who have open source affinity called the OSA community that we draw our solution architects from. The OSA community, it's dedicated to helping companies use open source well. And it's just an open community. It's a very much similar to the PyData community or it's an extension of, let's say, the PyData community or the SciPy community or any other Linux community of people that care about open source, but also care about the business application of open source. So we have people in the OSA community who are at Wells Fargo, who are at JP Morgan, who are at suppliers, people at Quansight, people in the net, people, independent consultants, independent people out there, all join the OSA community to share their ideas about new projects. How do you make projects work? How do companies depend on open source well without absorbing too much technical debt? How do they manage that situation? Then OpenTeams basically provides a sales and marketing and distribution channel so that companies don't have to interact with 1,000 different suppliers, because every company has their own onboarding and procurement and there's a whole process they have to pay people. So essentially we help them be that single throat to choke, that single partner they rely on that will make sure they get delivered what they need. And then we use a network of solution providers, solution suppliers. That's the idea of the OpenTeams model. And so it's growing out of, we're already doing that with Quansight. Quansight is already doing that. And then my co-founder of Quansight and Matt Harward, who's involved with me at OpenTeams as well, we've been doing this for 15, 16 years. In fact, we've got the same business. And so OpenTeams represents an opportunity to take those lessons we've learned and share them with thousands of others, solution providers, solution architects, who know the technology, understand how to build the correct solutions, but don't want to have to build a business, don't want to have to hire salespeople and hire a marketing team or maybe they want to expand their marketing team, but it's a lot of work to do that. So we kind of do that, and then they have our network focus on the work to do and making sure that the projects are going forward, and then helping to, and we through the OSA community and other initiatives, we really want our open source projects to thrive. We want the resulting, we have example projects, 80 or 90 PyData projects that we're very familiar with, and then we're growing familiar with other projects that are of interest to our OSA community members and our solution partners.
Not just in Python, all over open source. Yeah,
all over open source. So we our roots are in the application of this concept to the Python ecosystem. There's Ruby, there's Go, there's Rust, there's R, there's
all the JavaScript,
all the JavaScript, TypeScript, Node, Node.js, TypeScript, JavaScript. Yeah, it's all over. It's React and all the different JavaScript libraries. Yeah, massive use. So that's what OpenTeams is about, and we realize there's an opportunity and a need to kind of grow this community. So we're very focused on helping people create business, create value for themselves, create value for their companies, while helping other companies lower their technical debt, reduce their ROI. There's a lot of opportunity to potentially replace expensive proprietary software with less expensive proprietary solutions that have more affinity to open source. Like we're not, you have to use all things open source. It's more of a, if you can, you do it well, you should do it. Use open source effectively to save money. But there are some problems that open source isn't going to solve and won't. And there's great solutions out there that our partners of OpenTeams they have products they're selling too. But we leave that up to our architects. At the end of the day, our solution architects are the ones providing those solutions. And it's finding the right solution architect to solve the problem you have. And then we layer on what we call project success, which is our management. It's kind of lightweight project management to assist our technical leaders and our solution architects with kind of some of the mundane stuff they don't want to have to keep track of.
Mhm.
What's on the project, who's billing, what hours have been spent, where is it, what's the progress?
All part of the
You know,
package to try to make sure that the partners only have to worry about the things that they're really, really good at and want to
correct.
have to pay attention to.
Correct. So that's the OpenTeams story, but I'm glad we got a chance to explain it in the context of a chapter in the larger question of how do we help open source be sustainable. I'll kind of finish the description with this one relation. We've recognized for a while, like when I wanted to get funding for NumPy, I couldn't. It's not like when it was hard. I couldn't just go out and people weren't handing checks because NumPy was being used by banks, right? But we did see that there's consulting revenue, and with consulting revenue, I could sponsor a couple of interns, right? There's a little bit of there's sponsorship that can come from consulting revenue around open source. And I would say with Quansight, and at Anaconda before it, we've kind of said, oh, here's Quansight, and then here's labs. And for the first time, we've actually enabled our paying people to work on NumPy, SciPy, Matplotlib, scikit-learn, and pandas at Quansight Labs. So I'm thrilled about that. And effectively, I want to help as much of that as possible to take place. But in addition, we've also uncovered opportunities where companies will actually directly pay for features. It's a little tricky because companies can't just capture an open source community and get and convert it to their whim. That would sort of undo the point of an open source community.
Yeah.
But instead, we build the relationship with them. We call it actually a community work order, but they can put their interest in what they want to fund, and then essentially fund community members who are already versed in the project, already have maintainer status, already have the commit bit, effectively fund them to make progress on things they know they want to make progress in anyway. And the companies also want to fund. So you have this connection issue. It's actually something we're going to release here probably in the next month, I would say. It's beta mode now. It's available, but it's still in alpha beta mode. It's something we've been calling reimbursable enhanced proposals for open source, or repos. And it's effectively a way for community maintainers and contributors create their workflows they want funded, and a way for companies also to put information about what they'd like to see funded, and then a site that they can publish that. And then we have a sales team that can actually help with the in-person conversations that really move the needle and make procurement happen when it's past, when it's more than a few $100s or a few $1,000s.
Yeah. Another experiment in trying to bridge that mismatch between how open source and open source funding can work versus how businesses have to do business because of the, either whether it's regulations or procedures or best practices.
Right.
There has to be a bridging organization or bridging entity to allow it to align and flow. Yeah.
There's a really good blog post written by Joel on software. He talked about why software either costs like $10 or $1,000, like sort of gap between the $1,000 per year versus the $10,000 per year. Like it really comes down to the sales process, and which carries all the way up to the buying power of individuals at a company. Like most organizations, you can put something on a credit card, but there's a limit. Like if you're spending more than maybe, and I don't know what it is, it depends on any company, but $4,500, I've heard of $5,000 is the limit.
Capitalization limits. I've seen that 5K number a lot. Yeah.
5K number. You see that kind of, I can make a 5K purchase. Well, how am I going to make a 105K purchase or a 500K purchase? Well, that requires a purchase order and a statement of work which means there's got to be a sales facilitation activity. There's got to be somebody who's tracking that down. And so our salespeople at OpenTeams, that's one thing we do at OpenTeams, is hire salespeople essentially to work for our solution architects. That's who they work for. They work for the solution architects to help get them connection to company needs. And I call our salespeople at OpenTeams customer advocates. Their role is to care about what the customer wants and to be the representative of the customer, and then be the facilitator of the sales process. So they're also project manager and project leader of the sales process to get the signed deal.
And like the almost ambassadorial function of that, because it's not like you can go out and say, hey, OpenTeams sells this service or this widget. It's like, well, what do you need? We can find the architect to build what you need, but like catching the attention of someone who doesn't know that
Yeah,
that what OpenTeams is offering, so
yeah. It's
that
actually really
human,
hard.
yeah.
I appreciate you bringing that up because it's been really hard to figure out how do we advertise OpenTeams? How do we
Hmm.
promote the fact that we've got a network of people that can do everything? You have to sell something.
And have people take you seriously. Oh, everything. Right.
Yeah, right. Sure. Yeah, exactly. Over time, I mean, obviously, I think it's the people, it's the
Hmm.
people who are actually working with and the clients, the work they're doing. We have the fortunate opportunity to build off of the Quansight story, which which itself spun out of Anaconda, which spun out of the NumPy SciPy success. So that's given us a starting point. So we have at least that set of open source solution architects and solution partners who can actually do the work for people in a certain space.
Hmm.
What we've just launched this year is really a focus around the expert network, around as a starting point. So what we can advertise and put on and talk about is, one, we can talk about focus areas, and
Hmm.
we're focusing around AI,
Big
data,
topic.
cloud, these topical areas of
Yeah.
capability, AI data management, and cloud. And so we have those three areas of orientation, kind of grouping of people. And then we also have a, a very tight focus around the expert help. So we're going to market with training. I'm very close to training as mentoring, office hours, and kind of getting started with somebody. And
Hmm.
then obviously the long-term goal is to build those relationships so that people find their expert help they need to
Yeah.
support them. We also have a unique product that actually is available that is hard to find. It's a general incident-based support for all of your open source. Well, formally it's over 600 open source projects
Hmm.
that you can get attached to. And the way we implement that is we provide the top layer tier one kind of, okay, what is it? What is the question? Is it just it's answer the documentation, or it's a simple answer? But then we pass that on to our network. We look for people who are just available on a 1 to 2 day to 5. They tell us what their SLA is available. If they're available, it takes them a day, it takes them 2 days. Just let us know, and we find people who can answer more difficult questions around projects. So
Hmm.
we have this expert help network that we're creating. So to provide for companies this, how do I support, or this incident-based support capability.
Hmm. Yeah. I've been watching the pivot on that the kind of the leading sales initiative transition to that training focus, and I realized it seems like I'm excited to see how it goes, because training, I realize, is something that a lot of companies are already, that's something they're already expecting to have to contract externally to get. So one of the questions, I don't think we've talked about it yet, is part of what OpenTeams offers is a contract to hire motion for clients. But
Oh,
that's
yeah.
sort of a new idea to a lot of clients, as I understand it. Whereas training, they're like, oh, I need to upskill my team. Who do I find outside the company? That's
Yeah.
a better alignment with current expectations than
Yeah.
just going straight to here, hire a consultant, for example.
Exactly. No, it is the general space of helping people upskill. So one of the things that we've innovated on with is kind of the idea of pairing some of our experts with people that want to learn. We have
Mm-hmm.
a residency program, which is related to the mentoring idea, which is basically somebody who, and we've successfully done this with a dozen companies and projects. We're happy to scale it to more. Where basically somebody, it can be expensive to get technical help these days.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Salaries have gone skyrocketing in the technical space as skills have become more in demand, particularly skills around certain areas, where it can be hard to get. It may take 10 years to create those skills.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing we've been able to do is successfully take transfer people. Maybe someone's a physicist, and with a year or two of training, they can actually become top in the field of AI and ML learning, but they're
Mm-hmm.
starting with a physics background, right? So we have this residency program where somebody can basically adapt from what they do know to what customers are wanting, with the help of a mentor who is not available full time for the project, but may be available 2 to 5 hours,
Mm-hmm.
even 1 hour a week. But they're able to communicate about what the needs are and do translation and guidance to the work that's being done. And so customers basically clients get top level work done with talent that's emerging,
Mm-hmm.
rising stars. So that's we've encapsulated that into our other arm of OpenTeams, which is called OpenTeams Global, which is just an HR company. It's basically, its whole purpose is to fulfill on the problem of open source is a global phenomenon, but employment is local. Employment has to satisfy various laws and compliance factors related to the different jurisdictions. But open source is just about the project, and people can, and I've had the pleasure of interacting with people all over the world.
Likewise, yeah.
Source. It's amazing, right? And so, but this problem of giving people careers in open source is a big one. And so OpenTeams Global is there to help. And and there's various things it does. We can talk about that. But one of the things I love about we're sponsoring at OpenTeams Global is the Open Source Professional Network, ospn.org. In partnership with OpenTeams OSA community, this is, go to ospn.org. You can see it's an open source professional network. Its whole purpose is to enable a career in open source across, hundreds of thousands, millions, it could be millions. I mean, there are 100 million people on GitHub. How many of those people identify themselves as having a career in open source is maybe not 100 million, but certainly million, I would say. And there's a lot of emerging people, especially in a lot of places where people are trying to figure out, how do I participate in this global economy? And open source communities are a great way to start. And you can actually do something meaningful, make meaningful connections, make an impact. And then as open source gets adopted inside of organizations, pathways to careers. Either, again, OSPN is a pathway to contract to hire, working for a company, or building your own consultancy, or creating a product company, creating your own company, right? There's a small percentage that'll do that too. So we kind of have covered the gamut with these organizations, and the whole goal of which is to support and sponsor open source participants. We talked about incubator a little bit. It's kind of what emerged from we talked about Initiate. We founded a company or a fund. It didn't quite finish by talking about OpenTeams Incubator, which is a formal organization and sister company of OpenTeams, whose whole purpose is to help people who have startups. And there's a small fraction, I don't know, maybe it's 1 in 1,000, maybe it's 1 in 100 at the most, probably, of people who want to have careers in open source will want to start a company. And OpenTeams Incubator is there to help and figure out, how do you go? I want to help anybody who's like me, who is curious and had a popular open source project, or even one that wasn't popular yet. So OpenTeams Incubator can help people go from idea to company. Multiple things, we could talk about that in a later webinar, but just you can go to otincubator.com, learn more about it. I have a colleague that runs it, and I get to participate from time to time and particularly help early stage startups and be an advisor to them. And so that's kind of the OpenTeams story. I said I would talk about the idea I mentioned. It's actually encapsulated currently in FAIROSS.org, FAIROSS.org. You can go there now, you can see it. It's currently incubating inside of Incubator still. It's still, it's not ready for prime time, but it's incubating. And we've tested it out. We've tested the idea. Have enough data to believe it will work, and that they're on both sides, both the people who will participate and then and how the money will be distributed. So FAIROSS, its whole purpose is to create a marketplace where open source can be fairly valued in an open economy. So the fair in FAIROSS is fair market value. It relates to kind of the same concept of, how do you know the value of something in an economy? And the way it works is FAIROSS has created an instrument that we essentially get companies to give some warrants or revenue stream. And warrants are a little easier, but they could also just do a revenue agreement. If they don't want to sell equity, they can do a revenue agreement with the open source community generically. So a company can say, well, I really want to support open source that I'm depending on. Great. What are you depending on? What kind of commitment will you make in terms of equity value or revenue value? And we track, FAIROSS is the custodian of that revenue and tracks where it should go. So we basically have a program like that, and I can go into detail about that, but not here. But we do there's a lot of work to actually figure that out. But it's a public benefit corporation. FAIROSS is its intent is to create an opportunity in a marketplace so that you connect the value of companies using open source to the communities that are producing it.
Well,
And
a key part of that is actually chasing the dependency trees all the way down, right? From what you said.
100%.
Yeah.
Yes. You have
So,
to basically make it every project to, um, and this is the governance of the project has to decide the allocation of their value. So if you get every project to say, oh, a good example is matplotlib, right? Or NumPy. NumPy, what's the value of NumPy? Well, part of the value of NumPy is Python itself,
mhm.
right? So, is that 50%? Is that 75%? Is that 20%? I don't know. And we could make some metrics around that if nobody told us. FairOSS will. Like, part of how FairOSS works is if nobody tells you, then FairOSS has a coverage. It's similar to a coverage tool or a dependency tool to say this is what we think it is.
Mhm.
But then the governance community defines it in a millibips table,
Yeah.
and you publish that millibips table.
Yeah. So we don't, like you said, we don't have to go into detail on it. I just wanted to make sure that piece of it, that it's not just the outer surface projects that get the support. The system is
Every
complete.
project. So
Yeah.
exactly, it's complete. So, because what happens is, and I've watched this with NumPy, for example, early on NumPy was a primary dependency, and everybody, I'm a NumPy user. And then, pandas emerged, and now people are pandas users, but they're dependent on NumPy. I think, there's arrows becoming the dependency of NumPy, but effectively, sorry, it's becoming a dependency of pandas. But, NumPy went down the stack. And so, and NumPy itself, Python went down the stack. libc, Fortran libraries are written in the 70s. Like, there's a lot of stuff out there that eventually moves down the stack. And so wanting to make sure that you build a system that ensures everybody who's been participating is really participating. So very excited about that project. Again, it's incubating right now. Look for it in 2 years and see what progress we've made. And if you're interested, please let me know. Get in touch. Would love to know if someone's interested in helping or being a part of that story. But it's very much an early stage company.
Yeah. So, anyways, you were about to circle back to describe in more detail. I interrupted you before you said it might have been more about the OSA community. I can't recall, or it might have been.
There's a lot of things I may have put a bookmark on. I can't recall.
Sorry about that. So I guess I'll push forward. So in some prior conversations, you've mentioned, I think that was a fabric of support, so that any given person.
Fabric.
Right. The funding fabric. So any given person who wants to make as I understand it, so we can check my understanding, any given person who would like to make a career out of open source, one source of revenue income is probably not going to be enough. It's going to have to be a combination of things. And part of what the offerings of OpenTeams, FairOSS, others, the Repos initiative, is all part of this patchwork, this fabric, and that people have to choose their own adventure of, all right, how can I successfully build this career for myself? Does that cover it?
That's right. There's a lot of opportunities these days. A lot of companies are hiring people who are experts at open source. So you look at the global story, it's about helping people get hired right into those roles. That is definitely an opportunity for people. I've got lots of friends who have gone to work for Google, Amazon, NVIDIA, Microsoft. We're eager to help people in whatever their journey is. There are a lot of companies who spend billions of dollars a year writing software, and we want that software they're writing to be more appropriately related to open source, and to have the money go to people who have affinity to those communities where possible. So, and then also get companies to think about sponsoring the open source they're dependent on. And one thing I tell companies out there, a lot of companies understand this, and what they've turned to is hiring. So many companies, they're kind of wired that way. It's much easier for them in some cases just hire some people than to put a funding rec out, or to understand how do I fund rec? I know how to get a rec in my company, to hire in my company.
Right. It's brand new procedures. They're not used to it. It's a different muscle.
Yeah. How do I spend money on open source? Like, do I buy a product? Consulting, a statement of work is a known thing. It's a known instrument, but not every company has budgeted for consultants, or they think that. But if you can help them understand their budget for consultants is actually part of their non-recurring engineering costs, or potentially it's part of their hiring costs. If they want to hire and extend their team, well, some of that money on the contract to hire can come in and pay for people to get a project done, and then some of those people may be available to be hired. if you like
Right.
them. So we actually help people convert their HR recruiting costs to open source, some of their non-recurring engineering statement of work available funds to open source, and then marketing dollars. A lot of times people spend money on marketing and events that can actually go towards funding specific tasks in open source as well. So a lot of this, what OpenTeams does is help connect companies with their budgets they currently have to the things they want. But just have the management muscle or the management connections to realize. So it's very much that impedance quarter wave transformer, that the impedance capture, that I'm an engineer by trade and a software developer. So a lot of my business concepts often refer back to my engineering training as well as my software training. So, one could say we're trying to create factory functions that produce classes that create sustainable funding.
There you go. There you go.
So for the
And
developers
then,
out there.
I mean, it's all ultimately helping people think outside the box on this important question of sustaining open source.
Yeah, exactly. But currently today, if somebody wants to have a career in open source, they are going to have a kind of a strategy that involves multiple pieces. You can get a job, and there are more out there, but they're not infinite. But there are jobs where you can get paid to work on open source with just a little bit of extra stuff. Quansight provides jobs like that, but NVIDIA is providing some jobs like that. Apple, not so much yet, but maybe Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon. Probably haven't mentioned several that I should. There are jobs like that, and if you join the OSA community, for example, you can get to know people that may have jobs like that for you. And the OSA community is a place to meet people. Now, the OSA community, just to be clear, is meant for the architects. So it's not open to everybody. It's open to people that have 7 to 10 years of experience in open source software development, and at least a couple of years of technical leadership, or leading a project. That's the intent of it. And you could you don't have to be looking for a job either. You could just be wanting to share your ideas and network with other people and meet people. That's not the community of people looking for jobs.
That's OSPN there.
That's more OSPN, and even there, you maybe not looking for a job now, but you maybe just want to be aware so later you can understand the ideas that are available. But anyway, that's how those are really more like they're more like community nonprofit activities. They're just meant to, they're social activities and intended to really help people network and connect. And the business function of OpenTeams is really about the sales team going to companies and being customer advocates, connecting with a network of people who sign up to be solution partners, training partners, mentoring partners. And that's a very, relatively straightforward, but still separate process. But that's what we're about at OpenTeams, just growing the market, growing the awareness, helping people do a better job of integrating open source into their companies and their organizations. And there's a lot of things that go wrong there, right? I have lots of anecdotes of stories where people have adopted open source and then found that, oops, I couldn't upgrade it. Now I'm 10 years later and I'm still on a version from 10 years ago that nobody knows how to maintain, right? And okay, that was awesome. You got quick adoption in your space, but now you're kind of stuck with software that nobody knows how to. And if the company would have connected with the open source community, they could have actually gotten the help they needed to upgrade along the way. And then efficiently too. It doesn't usually take tons and tons of money.
Yeah. Then on the flip side, a company could try, realize that they need to engage the open source community, but not have any experience in doing that, and rub a bunch of people the wrong way. Right. Do it poorly. Yeah.
Do it poorly. Yeah, exactly. One of the things I've said to people, for example, another snippet is, people go hire from the community. Great, I'm going to use NumPy. Cool, I should go hire somebody who's a NumPy developer. Okay, yeah, maybe that could be a good idea. But if you're only going to hire one, right? Then I mean, you have 100 things you're dependent on. You're going to hire 100 people with is that your approach? You're going to go get 100, one person for every project you depend on.
The logistics and finances there are dicey, to say the least.
It's dicey, right? It gets really, and in reality, every solution a company cares about involves dozens of open source software projects. It does, dozens.
Yeah.
hundreds. Actually, I see manifest files these days.
Hmm.
I made a career out of helping people deploy open source software.
Right.
It's not uncommon to have environments of open source that you're dependent on for your project to move forward that have 200 dependencies,
Absolutely. Yeah.
400. Yeah, the biggest one I've seen is 2,000. Right? It's like are you going to hire 2,000 people on each of these experts?
No.
It's going to be hard, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of helps articulate the problem that people have and the way OpenTeams is trying to help.
Hmm. So we actually have a couple of questions into Q&A that I think
Okay.
would be a good transition a bit from there. One of them, first from Jeremy, just in your experience working with clients and potential clients, how often do you see explicit budget lines for open source stuff, tools, initiative, et cetera?
It's growing, right?
Hmm.
Growing where people are intentionally allocating funds to uh, expand open source. And they usually do that more often by hiring people and giving them a percentage of their time. That's usually what you see is a
Hmm.
company goes, oh, I'll hire people for the NumPy community and let them spend half their time or 80 or 20% of their time, or sometimes 100% of their time. Usually that's pretty rare,
Hmm.
but give them an out. So that doesn't show up on a line item for a budget, but it shows up on their structure.
Job description. Yeah.
We will have projects where we actually call them community work orders intentionally. Um, we do have statements of work that do have line items for feature requests, things they want out of open source. The difference is effectively they acknowledge that if we can't get that feature into open source, then we're going to maintain a shallow fork for them. Like we're essentially
Hmm.
reifying what they would be doing anyway, but often
Hmm.
aren't aware of. Like quite often people they have workarounds in their organization. I've seen this all the time. They adopt an open source project, their internal developers write workarounds to make it work for them, and then nobody maintains those workarounds. So they're effectively creating these forks already. So we do these, so that's what we call statements of work. I would say, overall, it's a small fraction. Now, for Quansight, one of our partners, it's probably closer to 50%
Hmm.
of Quansight focuses on helping people who want to dedicate money to write open source software. So about 50% of its business is on people funding direct open source software.
Hmm.
But in the broader ecosystem, it's much, much smaller. 1%, 5%.
Hmm. Look, it's a major philosophical shift that first you have
Yes.
to see how important open source is and see the value of the community and the innovation of the distributed and community nature of it. See all of the collisions of systems and impedance mismatches between open source and business to realize, oh, it's a lot of bricks to pile on one another for a company to then say on a philosophical level, we need to choose to alter our business model to support open source
Yes.
software in this way.
Yes. I think generally, and I think it answers the question we're not going to be able to get to about kind of these people making private their projects. It's definitely a risk of kind of just the VC supported open source, I would call it, right?
Hmm.
Which emerged, not just VCs but large companies supported open source. I love that, except for this risk that can occur.
Hmm.
I would say, take a look at be on the lookout for our OpenTeams app, and we call it repos. That probably will be a brand that shows up online, but it could change. The brand name could change, but it stands for reimbursable enhancement proposals for open source. So this is money that it's a marketplace for connecting money that wants to fund open source. And right now, if somebody has to fund the whole thing typically, and a lot of times, can we actually make a collective community work order, a collection that essentially go to a different company and say, well, you participate at 25K, 50K, 100K to this 300K budget, and get 6 people participating. And then I think what happens when high profile situations happen, it enables this kind of community organization to occur. Linux Foundation has been doing it in a specific way, and they've been a real champion for the nonprofit activity, I think. And I think there's an opportunity to go even deeper with aligned incentives that around marketplaces. And so that's what we're exploring with at OpenTeams, and what we'll continue to explore as long as we can. And so we're excited about that opportunity.
Yeah, totally. Well, we've hit the top of the hour. We probably should wrap there. I'll call it for the event today. Thank you, everyone, to attended and asked questions. Thank you, Travis, so much for sharing your history, your perspective, and vision for OpenTeams and the OSA community. As I noted, we're recording the event, and that video will go up on our YouTube once it is ready. So subscribe there if you would. Check out openteams.com to learn more about us and our offerings, and we hope to see you at a future event. Thanks very much. Have a good one.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.